that the Europeans are far more advanced in data protection than the Americans. However, European policymakers could learn a thing or two from American data protection laws in the financial sector. We have a perfectly balanced panel here to discuss transatlantic and global data protection in the financial sector. Half of the panelists are Americans, and the other half are European, and I'm both. I have the great honor to introduce you to US Congressman Cliff Stearns. Mr. Stearns was a representative of Florida's 6th Congressional District for 24 years. During his long service, he chaired many committees. He was one of the main architects of privacy legislation in the US, and he was the chairman of the Transatlantic dialogue with the European Union. Mr. Stearns was the recipient of numerous medals and awards for public service. He also has a long list of accomplishments in the private sector. Currently, Mr. Stearns is a senior advisor for APCO in Washington, D.C. The next American on our panel is Andy Roth. Andy Roth was the chief privacy officer of American Express for many years. Under Andy's leadership, the Poneman Institute ranked American Express as the #1 most trusted company for privacy for 4 years in a row. Andy is currently a partner in the law firm S&R Denton, where he co-chairs the Global Privacy and Security Group. The third American is Harry Valetk. Harry is the Global Privacy Officer for MetLife. He's also a visiting associate at the Oxford Internet Institute. On the European side of the panel, I have the honor to introduce you to Rita Balogh from Brussels. Rita is a senior associate in APCO in Brussels office. She's an expert in European Union policy, and she advises clients on the ongoing legislative revision of the EU's data protection framework. Rita will be moderating our panel. The second European on our panel is Lindsay Cox from the UK. Lindsay is the Global Data Protection Officer for Barclaycard. She has 15 years of on-the-ground experience in the financial sector. Our third European on the panel is Paul Guertler from Germany. Paul is the Data Protection Officer for Targo Bank. He's also Vice Chairman of the GSE Data Protection and Data Security Workgroup, and he has authored many publications on international data protection in the financial sector. Just 2 words about myself. I have to confess something. I suffer from a split personality.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes, I'm Belgian and I'm American. And we fight a lot. And I have a foot in both worlds, and I do try to act as a bridge between the two. Last year I wrote an article on privacy, and I called it "Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus." And let's try today to bring the two planets a little closer together. Thank you, and enjoy our panel.
Thank you very much, Monique. Does it work? Yeah. So let me just quickly pick up on what you said, that we're from Venus and Americans from the Mars, and then the European data protection regime is so much superior to that of the United States. And we have the honor to have Congressman Stearns here, who actually put forward several proposals for bills to strengthen data protection in the US and also to create a level of harmonization at the federal level. So can you please tell us a little bit of what's going on in the US? Do you really think that the rules are inferior to the EU?
Rita, thank you very much, and Monique, thank you for the nice introduction. I'm delighted to be here and to participate. As Monique had indicated, I'm working now for APCO worldwide. This is my really 11th day of working for them, so I made the transition and landed on my feet. And as Monique mentioned, I've had 24 years in Congress, so I have a perspective of privacy, data security, and data protection. And I think this conference is very apropos. Looking through the different subjects, as I'm sure many of you had, I was really quite enchanted by one of the topics. It says, the Internet Freedom Philosophers of Law Meet Philosophers of Technology. So with that fanciful title, it's occurring Friday. I wish I could be here to decide which I am. But as Monique mentioned, I was chair of the Transatlantic Dialogue. That is, the speaker appointed me to represent Congress in meeting with all the European members of Parliament, and it was a high honor to do that. I would come over here with about 12 members of Congress to meet in Budapest, and next year Copenhagen, then go to Brussels, and then I'd bring them all back to the United States. And one thing that I felt very important, and I think as a private citizen working for APCO, I believe in the idea that a free trade agreement between the European Union and the United States is very important, both for our countries. In this high recessionary period now, and the thought of most countries going through austere cutbacks, a solution would be to have a free trade agreement where we could actually talk about new opportunities for its citizens and at the same time hope for many of them. In looking through your central theme here with privacy and data protection, reloading data protection, I can tell you that the United States, although many will look at us and say we have not passed a privacy bill, I had a privacy bill, I had a data security bill, I could not get it through the House of Representatives for a number of reasons, but that doesn't mean the United States is not doing something in these areas. In fact, the White House sometimes issues executive orders, and oftentimes the Federal Trade Commission is involved with doing things, particularly in enforcement. One of the things that always came up that I found was the Republicans were always talking about federal preemption, because right now, while the United States does not actively involve with passing a privacy bill, we have different states talking about data security, data protection, and privacy. So you have fundamentally each of the 50 states now developing their own view and perspective, which means in the long run that companies have to comply with 50 different states. So one of the things that I've talked about is some general baseline that we could have so that state requirements would be amended, overseen with a baseline of federal preemption for the country and for the companies, so they wouldn't have to be worried about liability. A good example in the United States, we had a great discussion on, in the event of a breach of data, how soon afterward does a company have the responsibility to notify its customers? We have talked about 30 days, 60 days, immediately. And I think in many of us, we just couldn't decide because many of the companies said that you can't do it for sometimes as many as 100 days. So that is one of the questions in the United States we're struggling with. But in the end, we have to come up with, I think, both the United States and Europe, an opportunity for facilitating global flow of information to foster competitiveness and economic growth. And reading over the EU amendments for EU data protection, I noticed a section dealing with the right to be forgotten. And I think that's a very interesting concept. I think many of us in the United States find it's not necessarily workable to actually implement that. And I think many of us on the consumer side, although we respect the idea that business would like to continue to keep information for whatever reason, particularly insurance companies, many people I've talked to said that they'd like to be able to erase forever some of the information they've given. Another question that comes up in the United States is dealing with the cloud computing, especially the Chamber of Commerce has come out with some strong views on this cloud computing. They recommend it qualify as neutral intermediary because in some cases the cloud computing providers act neither as processor or as a controller. Sometimes they don't have access to or know what type of data is being stored, especially if it's encrypted and access is restricted. And on another note, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce believes the right to be forgotten is technically totally unrealistic. That's the U.S. Chamber. So let me just conclude by saying that I'm here to talk about global reciprocity and to assure you that the United States has an interest in privacy and data security and that through the executive branch it's in more or less being offered. Today, over 1,000 U.S. companies subscribe to standards that are acceptable to the EU and enforced by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. I think this shows that the United States has found a way to reconcile our approaches to privacy, and thereby we can unleash the massive flows of data and commerce in the transatlantic marketplace. The U.S., like the EU, is currently in the process of reforming parts of its data privacy networks. Last year, President Obama released a privacy blueprint, reaffirming our nation's commitment to protecting privacy. So we can all work together. Since 2000, the safe harbor procedure that the EU and the United States agreed upon has allowed companies to do business together and essentially comply with the 1995 EU Data Privacy Directive. So we want to continue this type of approach. I think the safe harbors work, and we must realize that standards are necessary, and we want to make sure also that innovation is not slowed down, and also make sure that one size doesn't fit all. And let me conclude by saying that we in the United States and the European Union on these fundamental concerns about privacy and data security pretty much have the same values. It's just how we get there perhaps is different. So I think we can all agree that there is perhaps universally accepted principles for global data protection, and the larger good is more important. And I want to say that the United States wants to facilitate trade and economic growth between the two countries. In fact, the trade between our two countries, the GDP between the two of us is almost 60% of the world GDP, and for that reason we must work together. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your response. I mean, it's interesting to hear that you have 50 different states laws, while sometimes we have maybe the wrong impression that, you know, privacy is somehow, or legislation is somehow more harmonized. But I'm wondering, you know, if you have 50 different states laws in the US, plus we have 27 different laws in Europe, within the EU, and then since we're talking about the financial sector, that, you know, other areas of legislation like fighting terrorism and money laundering and bank secrecy also touch upon data protection and how you deal with data protection within financial institutions. I'm kind of wondering, from a practical point of view, from industry, how do you deal with such a patchwork of requirements? How do you ensure compliance when, can you actually ensure compliance when you are a data protection officer? Maybe we start with the our American colleagues, Andy, Harry. Andy?
Sure. I think part of it depends on what your footprint is as a company, but many financial institutions, because of the nature of the industry, have a global footprint, and you really have to focus on taking the highest standards and trying to globalize them. And so there are very interesting conflict of laws issues that arise, but for the most part, when I was at American Express, we filed a binding corporate rule application for employee and customer information, and that was just accepted in the UK, and we'll look for acceptance. They will look for acceptance throughout Europe. And a point about the FTC and safe harbor is that is not available to financial institutions in the U.S. because the FTC is not the primary regulator. So as a bank holding company, American Express and others are subject to very strict regulation in privacy. Security probably has more granular regulation right now with very specific requirements around encryption and storage. But it's become increasingly difficult to deal with the patchwork of domestic regulations, the different states on breach notification and issues like that. And there is a part of me, I have a Swiss wife, I'm in the process of becoming Swiss, have a very global perspective on these things. And I think that the EU has been courageous in staking out a higher ground in some ways based on principles. But the sector-specific approach that the U.S. has taken has actually been quite effective. And one thing that often isn't discussed is, independent of the regulatory environment, as a company, you still want to build trust and engage with your customers. So you're driven to act responsibly because more and more that's becoming a competitive differentiator. And I see some folks in the room right now who represent financial institutions who who really get that and live that. And so, so I think it is complicated. I think it is very difficult to solve for that last mile with local regulations. But the best thing that companies can do is look into the substance of the EU requirements, the domestic requirements, and try to build a very converged, and effective program that does the right thing for the customer and establishes a control environment. And the Congressman and I were talking earlier, right now it's critical for companies to be able to leverage technology responsibly. And so the one thing that we haven't been discussing much is what's happening in technology. And there's an exponential growth in technology, and companies are looking to leverage it more, and it really comes down to data. And financial services have probably been more advanced than other sectors in using data to understand consumer behavior and to deliver really relevant and valuable services.
Thank you. Harry?
Thank you, Rita, and thanks again to the organizers for having us and for you folks here to join us. I want to put, I guess, the challenge and the question a little bit in context for us. Some of you may not necessarily know or be familiar with the brand, MetLife, but just I'll give you a little background. MetLife is one of the largest, is the largest insurer in the U.S. and one of the largest in the world. We have 93 of the Fortune 500 companies as group customers for life, dental, and several other services. We operate in 46 countries around the world. I think about 19 in the European Union itself, and we have about 90 million customers around the world that we service. So the point that Andy made, I think, is an excellent one. That we comply with law, but there's a mandate that comes from that. We've been in business since 1868. We're a very old and reputable company, and we need to protect information because it's core to our business. Because people need to trust us with information so that we can issue policies. So the challenge of then complying with the patchwork of laws that are coming up around the world is significant. And I think it's important to understand also from the U.S. perspective that it's not just at the state level. I would just add that at the federal level, we actually have laws for health that govern our business, something that we call HIPAA. We have laws that govern how internet communications can take place for email marketing, and obviously laws around the financial sector and registered products and so forth. So on top of for MetLife in particular, we have 50 state laws that we have to comply with, but we also have several federal laws that we have to comply with, and then we have territorial laws like Europe and Asia and Latin America increasingly. So it is increasingly becoming a challenge to deal with all of these different laws, and the notion of interoperability is well underway. I think bottom line, you get through it by getting to the core principles behind it, being practical about what you're really looking to do, and getting more and more guidance from the various regulatory agencies about what the expectations are. Because sometimes the laws are written in a way that creates ambiguity from a business perspective.
So as a European, I would kind of wonder about which is the highest standards that you choose and live up to. Is it the European standards, Andy?
I think when you look at the two different schemes, based on the EU directive that's in effect now, the major difference is right to access to information, which is actually not a very substantial difference if you're a company that's focused on really strong engagement and transparency with your customers. I think there are several aspects of the new proposal, as Congressman Stearns pointed out. The right to be forgotten is a big departure from where the U.S. laws are. But at American Express, when I put forward the idea of going with a binding corporate rule, it was sort of shocking at first, but then when you start to unpack what the regulations are, there actually is a lot of harmony. And if you look at the new APEC rules and the APEC framework, and you look at binding corporate rules, and you look at what's happening in the U.S. with the multi-stakeholder efforts on self-regulatory guidelines, you can see a harmonization happening. And so there are differences, But when you really dig deeper and get to the core principles, as Harry pointed out, they're really not as different as people think.
And on that point, I would be actually interested because we have the honor to have the UK approach and the German approach, which we consider as two opposite when it comes to data protection in Europe. So I would like to know what you think. What are the challenges that you face as European compliance?
Yes, thank you very much. When I was responsible for coordinated data protection in Europe, the challenge was not so much that at first we did to take a look at the most strongest law, but from experience I know that it's not the law that counts, but it's interpretation. And when you take a look at the fines, etc., which have to be paid for data protection points, which you have with your data protection supervisory authorities, then in former times Spain and other countries were the highest ranking, and not countries like Germany, where you have a very, very strict law, but also 16, 17 local data protection supervisory authorities which interpret them in their own way. So from the point of view of a challenge to comply with a patchwork of laws, I would say the challenge definitely is the harmonization and the unique interpretation. Currently in the EU data protection law, which we have in the existing one, we have a very different interpretation and transformation into the local laws. But I hope with the new law it will be much more coherent in the interpretation, and so it helps to establish a compliance program which is then more or less the same in all over Europe.
I'm speaking mainly from the UK. I work for Barclays, so obviously in the UK we have the UK Data Protection Act. I agree with Paul quite strongly. It's all in the interpretation of it rather than the actual act. It's interpreted differently, and we also have the FSA, the Financial Services regulation in the UK. Which, as a financial organisation, we have to work very closely with those as well. In relation to other policies, we were talking earlier about anti-money laundering and sanctions, KYC policies, etc. And again, in the UK, the policies there are very, very strong. We have very strong sanctions, regulations, and all these fit very closely with data protection and privacy as well. And we're lucky in our company that we have other compliance areas that we work very closely with these to ensure compliance and to ensure that customers' data is secure and that we work together.
Thank you. Then the next question is, will the EU, the proposed regulation, solve these problems? I mean, it is about to create a certain level of harmonization, at least within Europe. And I will come back to Congressman to see how interoperable these rules may be and whether we can increase this interoperability at the transatlantic level. But I wonder to what extent the proposed regulation is solution to the problems that you're facing. What do you think about what's in the proposal? Are there any challenges? Are there any things that are really helpful to your business? Why don't I start with Harry from an insurance point of view?
Will it solve? Well, to be fair, there's a lot of good things that are going to come out of the regulation. It's definitely more challenging to look to 27 different member state laws and the data protection authorities in those countries to get guidance, to get general processor licenses to just do business, and to switch that model to a one-shop stop kind of approach and having one regulation to look to is definitely going to create a lot of opportunity and a lot of efficiencies. The challenges are that there's also a lot of granularity in that regulation. Granularity that to, you know, in a fair reading of it, is really focused to addressing some of the concerns that stem from technology, some of the concerns that stem from social networking technology, geolocation technology. You know, it's been said, I think, fairly that there's a question about whether this is the general data protection regulation or is it the internet data protection regulation, only because, you know, things of like notions of data portability, you know, what does that mean in the context of an insurance, of a hospital, of financial services, you know, notions of, again, right to be forgotten, which I guess really stem from the right to erasure, which was already there in the directive. But it's also repackaging to expect, to create an expectation in consumers that they can have their data forgotten, and as an insurer, you won't know that you filed a claim 3 years ago for the same injury. So there's, you know, it's going to place a challenge on companies to explain, no, you don't really have that right. You have the right to not have data applied about you, and it's going to create some challenges there.
Thank you. Andy?
So I think right to be forgotten in financial services has different challenges probably than it does in media and social media, which has major challenges around free speech. But pausing for a second on breach notification, which I know I'd be curious to hear the Congressman's opinion on as well. Very difficult to know when a potential compromise has happened, whether it meets the legal requirements of the breach. And that's because a forensic exam is going to take some time to do. It is also because usually there isn't sufficient logging to tell you who had unauthorized access, what was taken, and when that unauthorized access ceased to exist. So in the end, you're usually left with a bookmarked period of time when you know a vulnerability existed and then that vulnerability was closed. So I think that 24 hours is a very ambitious timeline. I think that 100 days is probably very disingenuous on part of companies, but I think that there has to be some more guidance on what is that critical threshold when you notify. Is it when you're legally required to notify for a breach, or is it when you have a high confidence that something could have happened? And so I think that there definitely are challenges. I think that there are some good things that can come out of companies rising to meet those challenges, and one of them is very strong information governance. So just having policies and standards internally is not going to be enough to satisfy the EU requirements, and frankly won't be enough to satisfy the legal requirements in the US. You really, it's up to companies now to organize themselves and to organize their data practices, data lifecycle management when they get rid of data, data inventory so they know what data flows through systems and where. And actually this is the best thing that companies can do now with the advent of big data, machine learning, and being able to drive really incredibly relevant and valuable services to market. But back to the breach notification point for the Congressman.
Let me just perhaps give you some specific examples that happened just last year. Mary Bono Mack was the chairman of what's called Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade. And it was a committee that I was chaired for 6 years before, and I had a data security bill. So we tried to pass this bill out of the subcommittee. And the two areas of contention was basically in data minimization, how much, what time period would it be, which is a little bit into the idea of totally erasing everything. But the companies who were involved and was trying to advise us did not want this data minimization because they felt they need this information almost forever. Perhaps people like MetLife and like the Chamber of Commerce felt the business needed it. The other contention was we have 46 states that are coming up with rules on how soon you have to notify people when there's been a breach. And I came down on, in both areas, one, that data minimization should not be total because I felt companies would need this. And the second thing, I felt that the amount of time, and I took more of a liberal stance, Mary Bono Mac wanted to make it starting out 30 days. They had to notify everybody. And this could be, if you're a Visa or MasterCard or American Express, or you're somebody even dealing in the federal government, it could be thousands and thousands of names. And the breach might be minor, may be major. So the question is, a lot of people felt that there should be automatic. In fact, in California, I think the state law is automatic if there's a breach. So the company has the obligation to spend the time and money automatically to notify everybody that there's been a breach. And possibly those people would be not impacted. I argued that as a start, why don't we put in a reasonable time? And so I took the other extreme. We finally reached, Mary Bono Mac, we reached a 60-day period that we had been part of the bill, and also the data minimization, we came up with a compromise. But just those two contentions slowed the bill down, and eventually it never made it out of the subcommittee, and which is unfortunate because it was a bill that I had done 6 years before, 4 years before, and it was pretty much the same bill. But I show you some of the contentious issues that even we see here in the European Union. And so historically, you should be able to come up with a reasonable understanding what should be done in these two areas, but it was difficult. Just an observation.
Lindsay, are these two issues, the right to be forgotten and breach notification, also problematic in the UK, or?
Well, it's probably like Andy was saying, in the financial services, the right to be forgotten is not so much of an issue as in probably other industries. And breach notification, we have very, very strong notification requirements at the moment. With the Information Commissioner, I notice in the amendments, the 24-hour has been moved to 72 hours, which makes it a little bit more realistic. Like Andy was saying, 24 hours, you don't know at that point, the full detail of the breach, and that obviously would cause great problems for us, and the size of the breach as well. So I don't think those two for us. They obviously will cause us some issues, but not as much as probably some other organisations.
Can I just pause? So in UK, it's 72 hours is the law now?
No, this is the amendment, the
amendment.
rapporteur's amendment to the new
And
regulation.
what is it right now?
There is no requirement.
No requirement.
No,
So they
no.
could not even respond and tell the breach to the customer right now in UK. Is
No,
that?
we don't have to. No, the
Okay.
requirement at the moment with
Goes to the regulator, though.
Yeah,
Goes
no,
to the
even
regulator.
the regulator.
Okay.
The requirement to the regulator is if it's a serious breach,
Yeah.
but there is no requirement. But then there's no guidelines around what an actual serious, definition of what a serious breach is.
And
So-
I'm sorry, Lindsay.
No.
And I would say, there is something to be said for that conversation about seriousness. Because if you read, if there is something currently underway in the States, referred to as like notification fatigue rather, where people are just getting notices so many that they're beginning to ignore them, and the whole purpose is kind of defeating itself. If you just took what's proposed,
or they're moving away from that company to a company that's not sending them the notices.
well, again, notification fatigue suggests that they've just seen it so much that they may or may not be taking action. So it's still kind of unfolding. But I think a good lesson from that is we should be defining what is serious enough to notify, so that consumers take action based on risk to themselves and not just by mere example. And I'll give you an example that comes up in large organizations. You have a mailing. That mailing has Harry Valetk in it. That letter is personal data. It has my name. It has got my address. And let's say I use a post office box. And that letter simply said your account has been renewed. And that letter went to Rita, and Rita sees my name. And is that a breach? And should I now I notified that she has a letter, and all it has is my name and my address. And you multiply that thousands of times in commerce around the world, millions even, and now you have notices flying everywhere. You have a lot of trees being used to spend paper, and people are just receiving these things, and they're going to stop taking action because they're just being notified that your data perhaps went somewhere else, as opposed to your data is at risk and you should take action.
So So I think, respectfully, when we talk about breach notification fatigue, I don't know that I've ever really subscribed to that, and I don't know that it's been incredibly persuasive in Congress. I think it doesn't put the best foot forward of financial services, because I'm sure that at the major financial service organizations, there is an enterprise incident response program. So the part that isn't being discussed is really Lindsay's role, is Paul's role, your role on the inside, that if you hope to comply with these regulations, you cannot do so ad hoc, right? So no matter where the chips fall in the regulatory landscape, the legislation that comes out, you have to be organized as a company. And again, that goes to your control and your engagement and trust that you build with the customer. So when a compromise happens, and there's a full gamut of compromises, right? There's a vendor who has information for the company that gets lost, or there's the sort of innocuous mailing. And sometimes you don't even know what it is. So I think the point that often gets lost is the operational side of this. And irrespective of where the actual legislation lands, I think there's a clear message to companies. Financial services have probably been leaders in this, to be organized from a risk management standpoint and to be in a control state that when something happens, you're able to address it swiftly. Again, for the business and customer engagement reasons, not just the regulatory reasons.
I think that's really interesting, especially from an organizational point of view, which brings me back to some of the provisions that were put forward regarding the role of the data protection officer. I'll let you react as well to the breach notification, but I would also be interested to see what you think about the DPO role, because you are one of those DPOs yourself.
Thank you very much, Rita. I would like to confirm what has been discussed from a practical point of view. In the financial industry, at least in Germany, we are actively investigating the internet through, let's say, white hackers. And if you identify there are some compromised data from certain banks, you must investigate from which and why and how this data have been put then on, let's say, a Russian server or so. And then it takes some time to make sure that you are quite comfortable to say these data were not leaked from systems of a specific bank, but from, let's say, partners of that bank who were in the process of transporting the data to a certain bank, and for that reason you have to take definitely much time to investigate thoroughly to make sure who is the controller of the data that have been transported to that server. And for that reason, definitely in the proposal, in the regulation, from a practical point of view, we need proportionality in it. There has to be some damage that is to be confronted for the customers, and then of course also it takes some time to investigate, otherwise you would have to inform the general public, and you cannot put and confirm the facts. So you have to have the time to get the facts, and of course there has to be some proportionality in it. In the German framework we have for now since 2009 data breach notification for the financial sector. It is necessary that certain elements like account number, etc., have been compromised. So in your example, only the address, if you have sent a letter to the wrong customer, etc., that's definitely not necessarily data breach notification. But sorry, I'm taking so long. Just for the role of the data protection officer. In Germany, I come from Germany, also represent a group of data protection officers. Generally, you could say the role is like in between a mediator, some elements as of a consultant, and of an independent control unit. So these three elements are relevant, but also relevant is the regulatory framework. In Germany, we are operating within a context of balanced decisions. So you can decide on a case-by-case basis as a data protection professional whether or not certain data transfers are possible or not. With the EU General Data Protection Rule, we have more or less prescribed actions within a framework of delegated acts. And if you are looking at for the role of the General Data Protection Rule of the Data Protection Officer, I have analyzed it, and if you take the sections 37, there are 8 tasks, minimum tasks, and if you look at the language, you have to inform, and once you have to ensure, once you have to act as a contact point, also once, and 5 times you have to monitor. So there's a certain shift towards data protection compliance, and I don't know why, but I think the power as the independent consultant and mediator shifts to kind of empowerment, but this is also a dependency within a defined scope. And so my interpretation of the General Data Protection Rule is that the role of the Data Protection Officer is more to become a Data Protection Compliance Officer, which is, in my view, from a practical point of view, not so good.
Thank you. I think we have about 5 to 10 minutes looking at polls. So I would like to open the floor for questions if you have any, please. I don't know how there's a microphone coming.
I'm live enough, I think I can. Andrew Adams, Major University. Going back to something that Harry mentioned earlier, how can the data protection provisions help to balance the innate tendency of the organisation to minimise their own risks and transfer the balance to making sure that the organisations also take account of the individual risk to the customer? Because a lot of the time here what we see is that the intent of the organisation in financial services to minimise their own potential downsides, and that often means that what they're looking at is the broad picture of all of their customers. And that's fine. But when you're the individual customer for whom this might be a really serious breach, but for whom the chances of that are small, and therefore the overall impact on the organisation might be small, how can we use data protection to try and redress the balance there in the interests on the risks and the threats between the large organisation and the individual customer?
So there's a couple of thoughts that are kind of floating in my head to that, to that balance. I think one of them has to do with the reputation of the brand. I mean, when it comes to notifying, from my perspective, notifying one customer when they really are at risk is far less risky to the organization than it is to try to cover it, because the consequences of covering are far greater. I mean, by notifying the individual, you may face some inquiry, you may face, especially if you do it promptly and you do everything, remedial afterwards, it's a far less regulatory risky conversation than it is to try to not do the right thing by the customer, because it's going to get out in an email. There's going to be public relations consequences. There's going to be regulatory and lawsuits to follow. So if the organization is well staffed with professionals who understand the risk profile, as you can see how I pointed it to you, if I'm having this conversation with an executive, it's an obvious risk evaluation in favor of notifying and doing so promptly. I don't know if that answers your question, or if Andy has a view. I'm sure he does.
So I would say that, again, a lot of people aren't familiar with all of the machinery that's in financial services, and some things about financial services that are different. So in the US, if there is a breach, the first thing that you do is make sure that your fraud controls are in place so that you can stop misuse of that information. And so there's really 2 different types of problems that can come from breaches in financial services. One of them is account hijacking, which is somebody gets your account number, they get your information, and they try to pose as you to take over your account and do damage to that account. That one is very easily controlled by the financial services organizations, right? Because they have a risk management and fraud group. It can put controls in place. You can issue a new account number. There's lots of different things that you can do. Where somebody gets a social security number, which doesn't have a complete analog in Europe, I guess country ID would be the closest, then it's very problematic because then it's beyond the financial services organization's control. But in my opinion, I don't believe that executives at Harry's company, at American Express, at Visa, are really having a risk-based conversation on these issues. I think that, unfortunately, these are issues that financial services have been dealing with for a long time. And if it meets a threshold of materiality that it requires a notification, they do so. And usually, most companies have in place a multi-stakeholder process for addressing these because they're coming up all the time, where you have risk management involved, you have privacy and legal involved, you also have your PR people involved. If it's HR information, they're involved. And so there's a lot that goes into it. I think it's a misperception that people are sort of scrambling and then deciding, weighing the benefits, and maybe it's only one person and maybe it was a mailing. It's something that people take very seriously. And again, as Harry pointed out, it's really your brand. And I don't think the risk profile changes whether based on the size of the potentially impacted population. I think it really goes to what are the data elements that were potentially compromised and how they can be used to do harm.
Let me just say one comment. Go ahead.
Sorry.
The threshold at which a company has to spend the money to notify is dependent upon the information that's released. And when we were in this debate in the U.S. and Congress, we found companies coming up to us and outline where it took them 100 days to determine whether the threshold was met. Now, I'm not quite sure why it took so long, but they made a strong case that 72 hours or 48 hours is too short a time to make the assessment. So I don't know how you resolve this because there's so many components to this threshold, and then the implication of what happens if, for example, Rita gets Harry's address. Is that a big deal? And should there be a notification because of it? Because it's pretty minor. And
It isn't a big deal. I have a view.
you think it's minor or not?
I do. I think it's minor.
I think it's very minor. And so what Rita's going to do, her reaction is going to come to the company and raise heck and say, what has happened? And Harry, and so the whole thing you have to decide during this process, can you do it in 48 hours or 72 hours? I don't know.
I'll take one more question and then I allow Paul and Lindsay also to react. Please.
Yeah, maybe this is a completely different issue, but I wonder about a data abuse or a data leak that is, thanks, my name is Gary Marks from the United States and Monique. Maybe this is a different issue, but what about a data release or a leak that is put in a context or perceived by the leaker as a form of whistleblowing or doing well to reveal abuse that the person releasing the data believes would not otherwise appear were it not for some alternative means of communication. Maybe it's for a different panel.
Let's
So,
repeat the
I'm sorry, but
question.
what's the? I hear your question, but so what would you like us to evaluate? Whether that's a breach or what to do about that?
What's your response? How do you think about that? How do you approach that? How cleanly can we separate intentioned evil abuse from well-inspired releases that, from a standpoint of morality, popular conceptions, would in fact be appreciated
WikiLeaks
even
kind
if
of
it
thing.
violates internal policy.
Something like the WikiLeaks,
Right.
something like that.
Yeah,
That might be an example. Well, I think in Congress we would say, depending upon what your persuasion is, though, that if the information that's revealed is compromising the corporation, that they did something illegal, then that would be considered substantial enough to corroborate the leak. Because you see a crime being occurred, you'd never find out about it except with this whistleblower. So in the end, the overriding concern is this corruption that's rampant, and the person has made that public. And so whether this is going to be injurious to the company, that there was a leak, is minor compared to the fact that this company has rampant corruption. So I think members of Congress, at least I would side upon the whistleblower to think that, thank you for doing this. We want to get the larger issue, this rampant corruption, and not worried about this breach of data security.
I would say there are probably concurrent issues that need to be addressed at the same time. So every company has an ombudsperson in the U.S. Under SEC regulations, and they handle whistleblower issues. I think there was an established conflict of law issue with SEC regulation and the EU a couple of years ago that seems to have worked its way through. And so if you have and many financial services organizations that are subject to Federal Reserve board review have a data leakage prevention program, a DLP program, where they look at that stuff. But if you had a leak of confidential and say proprietary trade secret information, something like that, but it contained personal information about customers or employees, I think there would still be a breach notification requirement that the company would need to work through, and the company would also have liability at the same time for the contents of the allegation or whatever was breached. So again, it mitigates towards internally being organized across different stakeholders, because that is a classic example of where something can impact many different parts of the organization. And MetLife and Barclays and many of the other leading financial institutions have already organized themselves internally to be able to coordinate across stakeholders, because many of these issues do not sit cleanly in one category.
Thank you. A very quick question I'm going to take, and after that, I think I'm going to just ask one last question to Lindsay in particular about, we talked a lot about technology and how it changes and the different platforms that we're using. And I was wondering, are you using these new platforms like mobile platforms? And we were, like Congressman Stearns mentioned cloud computing. How does that intertwine with the financial sector? Does it cause any difficulties? And then before you answer, I'll take the last question from the audience as well.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Esma Aimer. I'm from University of Montreal, Canada. I just want to ask you a question because I'm very concerned. I have been a victim of identity theft from Visa. So I don't know what happened. I did notify them because I got 2 statements on under my names too. So I was just like, oh my God. So I called them, they did their investigations and they gave me my money back after 4 or 5 months, but they never explained to me what happened. And I got like frustrated because I didn't know how to deal with this. I didn't know how it happened. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
So Lindsay, would you like to take my question first, and then I leave the other panelists to answer this more tricky one, and maybe to kind of also have some concluding remarks, because I think we're running a tiny bit late.
Okay, I know we're running out of time, so very quickly, technologies, particularly mobile devices, and very, very pertinent in Barclays at the moment. As you probably have heard of a lot of the technologies that we have out there. We've got the contactless card. We now have things called pay tag, pay band, where you can wear a band and be able to pay for going into concerts and things, and be able to use the band and load it with money and use it in that respect. And the pay tag is very similar, that it sticks on the back of your mobile phone and you can use that as a contactless payment. And there's all sorts of things coming out gradually. I have to confess, it's taken me completely out of my depth in respect of privacy, because the business comes to you with these challenges, and you're expected to know, you're expected to be not only a privacy officer, but you're expected to be technically competent, you're expected to know all about social media, you're expected to know about mobile technology, the security behind it, and it's very, very difficult. Luckily for me, in our company, we do have other areas. We can have these security experts and technical experts as well. But it does give great challenges around the security of the data. And as you know, with mobiles in particular, they hold a lot more data than mini computers, but they hold a lot more data than actually your computer does, and they're on all the time and with you all the time. So yeah, I don't know, Paul, got anything else to add?
Just just wanted to answer the question that you have asked. Basically, I think it's the relationship between your bank or your financial institution and the customer. And I think most of the banks, at least, would tell you what had happened, not in great detail, but at least to let you know what happened in general. So I think it's perhaps time to think about changing your bank.
Let me just add that I've heard many examples where the person has had their identity stolen or their things have happened and things have been erased, and the explanation, whether it's Visa or the bank, is very unacceptable. And I've heard this again and again. And so, I would think this is an area that there should be some kind of minimum reply so that the person understands what happened. Because just getting a new credit card or just going on with your life and saying, what happened, where is my information, and what's the implication? You don't know. And that's how you feel, right? Yeah. Okay. So the bottom line is there should be an opportunity for the customer to get a full explanation of this. And if you can't do it, then they should say to you, we don't know. Did they ever tell you they didn't know, or did they just sort of stonewall you?
They didn't say anything, so it made me write a paper on identity theft.
Yeah.
I published the paper at the PSC conference, Privacy, Security and Trust conference.
Okay.
Yeah, so I wanted to work on this area because I was really
Well, I think that's a very good area because I've heard the same type of things. In fact, member of Congress, a woman from Wyoming, lost her identity, and she found it very unacceptable what happened. And then a person where I work at APCO, his daughter recently had the same thing happen, and on the iPhone, and he went hours and hours on the phone waiting through a computerized phone message, and it just went interminably, and he was just so frustrated, and he never was explained. So I think your problem is very similar to what other people have, and I think it should be addressed.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I can take one last question, a very, very quick one, and I will ask all the panelists to answer that. So
Okay.
be mindful what you're asking.
You want to take
Right,
this
in
one?
fairness, I won't ask a question then. I'll make a short statement, only because I'm Chief Privacy Officer for Visa. We at Visa do not have relationships with cardholders. We do not know who they are. We don't know what the underwriting is. We process the information based on the accounts. So you would not have spoken to Visa. Visa would have simply referred you to the bank that you do deal with. So as a favor, and I hope your paper doesn't slam Visa, because we did not do it. The same, the complaints raised by the Congressman, who's done terrific work in this area. And you pointed out in your opening remarks how the cloud is a neutral processor, intermediary. Visa is also a processor, and that the cardholder relationships and the merchant relationships are independently run with a lot of different banks. It does sound like you might have wanted a different bank, and I apologize on behalf of the bad service you got from your financial provider. I'm sure it wasn't American Express either. But we do play a lot of different roles, and that Visa is a very strong supporter of privacy and especially data security, but we do not get involved in how different banks choose to underwrite different relationships with cardholders.
So then my closing question, and I'm going to benefit from Congressman presence here. We talked a lot about harmonization between EU and the US. So I think my very, very last question with that, I'm thanking all the panelists. I'm sorry we didn't have time for the concluding remarks for each and every of you, but I'd like to have your views, Congressman. Is there a chance for transatlantic interoperability?
Your question is, will there be compatibility between the EU and the United States? And I would say yes. Let me just say the President recently directed NTIA, which is part of the Department of Commerce, to hold a series of stakeholder meetings to look for a consensus on privacy standards so he could go forward. And I think once his consensus is reached, the executive branch will voluntarily try to set these in place through executive order and ask the Federal Trade Commission to make them comply. The FTC is continuing to look at privacy practices by companies by using what's called Title V enforcement power to investigate companies that are not complying with privacy policy. So I want to assure the audience and the members and participants of this data protection conference that the United States is still moving forward, even though Congress might not have a privacy bill, between the federal and the executive branch trying to develop a consensus on privacy and the Federal Trade Commission through Title V. There is indeed a forward movement, and that is going to be consistent, I think, with the European Union's actions, because ultimately everybody wants to do business, everybody wants to create a profit, and everybody wants to move forward, and it's to our advantage to do so.
Thank you. And with that, I hope to continue the discussion over coffee upstairs. Thank you very much for coming.